Welcome to From the Spectrum podcast. This is a podcast about autism. It is my goal to explain what is autism. I plan to use a mixture of scientific literature, personal experience, and opinion. With opinion, I will explain why I feel the way I do and give examples. I will provide links to various references for each episode. For each episode, we will discuss various aspects of autism. Before we begin, I'd like to highlight some more on the cause of autism. I feel it necessary and worthy to explain more detail about the human biology. Human disease or conditions or health impairments, whatever you want to call them, such as autism, translates environmental signals that inform our genes on how to respond. What conducts our biology, those environmental signals, are electromagnetic fields. We've discussed light as an electromagnetic strip. This informs the body how to respond. Disruption in our healthy environmental EMF signals creates the disease, impairments, etc. Here we are talking about things like protein and DNA sequencing, electron transport chain in the mitochondria, the water metabolism, and processes within the cytochromes, healthy or unhealthy cell development, cell life or cell death, etc. Autism is our biological response to changes in EMF, the light source. This ought to be of consideration when we explain. When autism research explains there are over 100 risk genes that cause autism, that are involved in autism. And also, these over 100 risk genes doesn't mean you have autism. Something about that does not add up. For today's episode, we will cover why autism and ADHD are very distinct conditions and should have caution before being comorbid diagnoses. I want to say, if the children observed by Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger's were observed today, if they were alive today, they would have received an ADHD diagnosis, likely comorbid with autism, and they would likely receive oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD. More on those in a bit. Remember Erwin Schrödinger's comments on Leo Kanner. Schrödinger said about Kanner thought what nobody has yet thought about that which everybody sees. If we look at autism and even the modern day ADHD condition, everybody can see something is going on. Something isn't exactly right for the children. And mostly we think some sort of intervention needs to be implemented, some sort of help. And remember, Schrödinger's work very much explains the part that we began with about the electromagnetic fields and how life uses light. We cannot forget this. Modern accreditations, or medicine and society even, they can't have just a singular cause for the autistic disturbances. These so-called differences in socialness relative to social norms. Either it lacks critical thinking and understanding, or it acts as a conveyor belt for prescription medications. Both reasons are wrong, and both are harmful. If you zoom out and look at society, look at our children, something isn't right. Now we can see that. That doesn't cause conflict. But the reasons that's for these modern day health conditions and these situations where more and more diagnoses are occurring, there are a couple things wrong and a couple of conflicts that these create for both the lay public and professionals. Neurodiverse is a touchy and maybe harmful movement. People identify or claim to be here. Society subordinates or subjects people as this, and essentially, it's just labeling people. Something humans love to do. People will say, oh, that's just my OCD, or oh, that's just my ADHD. Okay, so now what? One, it's not even OCD when people are saying this loosely. People will say this in example of, oh, everything must be in a certain order. I like it in alpha order, or everything must be straightened up, just right. That's not OCD, but people will just say this. Now, if you have to touch something a certain amount of times, or until it feels right, or if it has to make a certain type of noise before you can move on, then yeah, maybe that's OCD. But people say this. They say, oh, that's just my OCD, or oh, I'm very OCD, without it having any context or accuracy. Also, it is easy for people in society now to say, oh, that's just my ADHD. Maybe they're forgetful, or they have a hard time concentrating. This is what we're going to parse out. The ADHD inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, and autism. These are very distinct conditions. Yet, society comorbids these over half the time. And I want to clarify the distinct natures, the distinct characteristics of autism versus ADHD. These ought to be very rare. Most importantly, we need to remember criteria B3 of autism. Now, when we talk about Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger's, and even some of the children before them, the characteristic that showed up and made people think, well, something's different here with this child. It involved within the child being removed from the influence and the surrounding environment, the lack of integration in society. Some notes from Leo Kanner's first child he observed with autism, Donald Triplett. His father said, Donald is happiest when he was alone. He draws into a shell and lives within himself. He is oblivious to everything around him. When interfered with, he throws tantrums. And if you think about ADHD and the inattention, the hyperactivity, and impulsivity, surely you can draw a connection here that autism is what's causing it. However, it's easy for others to say, Donald doesn't even pay attention. He should be paying attention. Or if somebody interferes with him and he is upset and throws so-called tantrums, well, now people will say, well, that's hyperactivity and impulsivity, and he cannot control his behaviors for this environment. He needs to remain seated and pay attention. Remember, there are a couple of possibilities here that are influencing this within the autistic phenotype. One, the outside world is chaotic. for the autistic. But 2, at the core of autism is that B3 criteria, that B3 symptom or trait, the phenotype, whatever the language. And we will show even how the human language was very confusing for the children back in the 30s. B3, remember, is restricted, fixated interest that are so-called abnormal in intensity or focus. Strong attachment to or preoccupation with unusual objects. Excessively circumscribed or perturbative interest. And remember in the Rates of Autism episode, when we explained Jean Piaget in 1923 captured, he found that children had a visual thinking, imagery thinking ability. And this is autism. This is what really made Temple Grandin stand out, the Thinking in Pictures book. The Piaget publishing predates Kanner and Asperger's. But Piaget was during a time with Eugen Buehler, where it was more of a twilight peak. However, I suspect Piaget thought maybe something else was happening here. And we covered this. We covered the twilight peaks and these thinking in pictures capabilities. The outside world is not as interesting. So at the core of autism, the true characteristic is B3, restricted, fixated interest that are abnormal in intensity or focus. From here, all the other characteristics branch off. Remember, we've discussed, when we have time to attend to our B3, whatever fixated interest we have, that helps B2, the adherence of inflexible schedules, needing that routine. That lightens that up. And we have a better ability to adapt to those schedules if we have time for the fixated interest. And let's not forget social communication and interaction, the entire criteria A, which is what is mostly observed and thought to be autism. But people have it backwards. Criteria A shows up because of the criteria B, that self-sufficiency. Kanner suggested it was an innate disorder. Now, we're going to read a little bit about Kanner's children and Asperger's children and letters from the parents at this time. We will cover Donald Triplett, the first person ever diagnosed with autism. What his father provides to Leo Kanner is telling. This is what is missing today. Society loves to lump things together, disintegrate everything, just throw a bunch of things at one thing, and it helps them. It makes them feel better, like they're doing something. Oh, I'm helping this child. They have this, this, and this. All of this makes sense to them. Let's review some of the key symptoms or traits or characteristics, whatever you want to call them, of autism and then of ADHD. So criteria A, we know. Social communication and interaction. A1, deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging from things like back and forth conversation and a reduced sharing of interest or emotions or affect, and a failure to respond. A2, deficits in nonverbal communication behaviors. Remember, a large part of the human communication is using social cues, things like eye contact and hand movements or eye gaze, where your eyes are looking, facial expressions and such. A3, deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. Now soon, we'll have an episode on autism and relationships. This has been finished, but I keep putting it back because it seems like more and more salient topics of autism has been hitting me lately. things like the cause of autism and autism research, and this ADHD comorbid situation. A3 captures this lack of interaction, this lack of imaginative play and sharing. Remember some of my personal experiences, the things that I've mentioned about playing games, make-believe games as a child, and it's going differently than what we established, and me getting upset, what you will see later as tantrums from the Kanner and Asperger's kids. But remember where this stems from. This stems from that rigid thinking patterns, the black and white thinking patterns. So now B, criteria B, restricted repetitive behavior, interest, or activities. B1, stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, or the use of objects or speech. Things like echolalia, or lining up and flipping toys. B2, insistence on sameness, that inflexible adherence to routines or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. Rules are rules, and if they're changed, well then that doesn't make sense. Then B3, we've covered. And then it ends with B4, hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. It's not hard to understand or see examples of sensory processing problems with the autistic phenotype. So a brief review of these is the social communication is poor. That's understandable for you as well. The schedules and the rule shifting. Remember, autism and adaptive responses. We don't have those adaptive responsing that others have. Remember the neurobiology up through the medial prefrontal cortex and the ACC areas. This is well researched in autism. And the routines and the ability to be sensitive to things in our environment. Now, if you think about it, before we even review ADHD, you might think of someone with ADHD who's very chaotic in their environment. They are constantly moving around, fidgeting. They are getting in trouble. They can't sit still. They're not paying attention, and so forth. But we've covered these autistic phenotypes that can lead to those behaviors. See, this is what we need to really parse out. The criteria that autistic phenotype can cause many problems in the environment as the autistics are navigating the environment that will show up with similar features of ADHD or ODD. And we have to really understand that autism causes this. Autism gives us those maladaptive responses or a lack of adaptive responses. That chaotic outside world that presents an overwhelming feeling. And remember the autism and anxiety episode, where we highlighted those 3 key features in anxiety. Avoidance, the physiological response, and valence, attaching an emotion or an outcome, positive or negative, to whatever environment, whatever situation the living organism is navigating. Okay, some of the ADHD symptoms, starting with criteria A, inattention. A1, often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes. B, often has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or play activities. C, often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. D, often does not follow through on instructions and fails to finish schoolwork, chores, or duties. E, often has difficulty organizing tasks and activities. F, often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to engage in tasks that require substantial mental effort. G, often loses things necessary for tasks or activities. H is often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli. I is often forgetful in daily activities. Okay, criteria 2, which is hyperactivity and impulsivity. A often fidgets with or taps hands or feet or squirms in seat. B often leaves seats in situations when remaining seated is expected. C often runs about or climbs in situations where it is inappropriate. D often unable to play or engage in leisure activities quietly. E is often on the go or driven by a motor. F often talks excessively. G often blurts out an answer before a question has been completed. H often has difficulty waiting his or her turn. I often interrupts or intrudes on others. Okay, that's a lot of symptoms. There's a requirement. You must have 6 of inattention to be diagnosed as inattentive, or 6 of the hyperactivity, impulsivity to be diagnosed as that. So this is important too. You can have an ADHD diagnosis with just the inattentive type or just the hyperactivity, impulsivity type. And there are different specifiers. Okay, not really important. What is important is these symptoms get lumped together and people cannot discriminate them properly, which is why the Erwin Schrödinger quote on Leo Kanner fits today. We lack a Leo Kanner. Let's parse this out. ADHD 1A often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes. 1, we already innate. We already within ourself. And remember, are you even interesting? And that does not dismiss who this other person might be or what their role might be it an educator or even a parent or a friend, a supervisor. These things can have tremendous challenges. B often has difficult sustaining attention in task or play activities. Well, this is criteria A and B3. The social communication and interaction, the autism in relationships, are already a challenge. Plus we lump in B3 when we have a different restricted or fixated interest at the moment. Remember the autism social communication highlight of leisurely back and forth or shared imaginative play or interest. Is the autistic inattentive or is the autistic bored? Checked out. And then probably the easiest one with the inattention of ADHD is C. Often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. This is the whole reason autism exists. This from the little children back in the 30s with Kanner and Asperger's. It seemed like they weren't there. 1D often does not follow through on instructions and fails to finish schoolwork. Remember neuroplasticity with the Autistic Phenotype. Massive amounts of things and expectations go bad. This becomes expected as we navigate society or navigate a school building or a school day. We expect, well, things here are going to be overwhelming. It's not going to go right. There's going to be a lot of things that don't make sense. And remember the closeness to perfectionism. Perfectionism tracks heavily with the autistic phenotype. And I think this exists because of those self-sufficiency. Remember the comparison to B movie. We are just very self-efficient on our inside with our thoughts and our imagination. And don't underestimate the amount of time we spend with this so-called innate ability. We have the ability to perfect this. However, once we integrate with society, other people, and other environments, obviously, there are a lot of external stimuli coming into play. And another potential factor is we want to fit in, but in our ability to fit in, not from what society says or not how society says we ought to, which can explain 1F as well. And this is a huge distinction between autism and ADHD. ADHD 1F suggests people avoid tasks that sustain or that need mental effort, a long sustaining mental effort. And this is very different between autism and ADHD. With autism, there's a lot of things that don't make sense on the outside. Remember, we are integrating different forms of speech and communication and sensory processing and trying to make sense, trying to create order with that disorder from the environment. At the core of human advancement is speech and language. This is how we advance and sustain our species. The conveyance of information and instruction. With ADHD, it should appear that this is more of a concentration or that inattentive problem. And remember B3, the fixated interests that are so-called abnormal. The key here is it interesting or not? And is society saying the autistic must give effort and attention here to whatever that project or task is? Then jumping up to H is often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli. Well, we know the sensory processing. This is understood by the lay public and the professionals. There's a sensory processing phenomena here, which also explains down to the hyperactivity and impulsivity A, often fidgets with or taps hands or feet and squirms. This will be highlighted in the Kanner paper. This is highlighted in my personal experience. And this is part of that stereotypy motor movements. This occurs in the Autistic Phenotype. Remember the excitation, inhibition, imbalance. The overly excitation is generating these motor movements, that metabolic energy going on within us. B often leaves C in situations when remaining seating is expected. Back to the sensory processing problem. Things get overwhelmed, and if you're a child, especially if you're a child, you have no idea how to communicate this, especially if social communication and interaction is already a problem. This sensory processing is lumped into this hyperactivity, impulsivity language. Same with E, often on the go or driven by a motor. Well, it depends on if it's the motor movements, the excitation and inhibition, or downstream from the sensory processing phenomena. Now, I will say that both autism and ADHD are well-researched problems in the striatum. We've covered the striatum pretty frequently. It's a place where motor movements and motivation converge, and they produce a behavior. You also probably know that tics, Tourette's are highly involved here too. The problem is, since ADHD is kind of a buzzword, it's at the forefront of society's attention. They just think these motor movements are hyperactivity, impulsivity. If we look at Fritz V, the first child in Asperger autistic psychopathy, he was very fidgety and could not control his motor movements. With Asperger's syndrome, there is a lot more conduct problems than what Leo Kanner saw. Today, that's a go-to ADHD diagnosis and something like the ODD or conduct disorder. And then also there are some contrasts, some major contrasts here. Back to the inattention. Often fails to give close attention. Well, if you have B3, if it's a restricted, fixated interest, well then how could you have both? Or often has difficulty sustaining attention in task. Well, if you have B3, that core of autism, this is very much a contradiction, a complete opposite. And to sum up ADHD, in inattention, items A, B, C, and F could have many different reasons why this would occur. There are many different scenarios that causes this with all humans. Now, I understand, just because we're parsing out the difference between autism and ADHD, that the ADHD requirement, you must have them for different environments and a certain length of time. Criteria B, the hyperactivity and impulsivity. Most of these are just typical responses when the human has reached a sympathetic nervous system, when our alert and stress system is responding a little bit too much. And in social environments, the classroom or a playground, whatever the case, this happens for the autistic phenotype. It happens quite easily. When I see or whenever I hear children, or just anyone really, diagnosed autism and ADHD inattention, nothing about this makes sense. This is almost impossible. This is also true with the autism and ADHD diagnosis with the hyperactivity impulsivity specifier. Yet, there are so many cases of this. This is our paradigm. This is our shift. ADHD today is a buzzword. ADHD is a hot topic. One, there are prescription medications, a whole plethora of them, a whole menu of options now. Before it was Adderall and then methylphenidate, but now it's mostly methylphenidate, Concerta, Vyvanse. You have all of these prescription options, and it's easy to get these. And society, the manufacturers are running out. They can't keep up with demand. This is a problem. This ADHD diagnosis is a conveyor belt for this prescription medication. We think that children, or even the adolescents and adults, they can't navigate this modern world with the changes in light source and the time removed from the sunlight to the artificial light and all of the non-native EMFs. Everything is changing, and instead of addressing the problem, we're just going to throw prescription medications out at it. Throw prescription medications out towards the public. It's so easy to go into your PCP, talk about inattention problems, or my child has inattention problems. He can't sit still. Okay, try this medication. That's our first line. And people get diagnosed with autism and ADHD and the whole smorgasbord within the DSM. A couple of anxiety situations, ODD, remember oppositional defiant disorder. This is the absolute worst diagnosis. Only a human creation would do such a thing. Tell a child, tell a parent, tell a loved one, a guardian, that, oh, your child has oppositional defiant disorder. I've seen parents just totally have the hope sucked out of them. Hearing these words, oh, they're ODD, is suffocating their hope. It's not enough for a child, for the accurate occasions of having ADHD and having that hyperactivity and impulsivity, having troubles controlling oneself as they navigate the environment. They must have ODD as well, or conduct disorder as well. It's not enough that the hyperactivity impulsivity can explain it. It's just, here, let's throw on these other symptoms or these other diagnoses too. As in, we don't want a singular thing to explain any one thing. We just want to throw multiple diagnoses out at these conditions, at our living situation, and call it good. This makes the provider feel good about whatever it is they're doing. They think they are helping, and it calms them. Oh, I'm doing my job. This is the training. This is what training and the paradigm says. He or she meets symptoms for 6 diagnoses: autism, ADHD, general anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, ODD. What is the purpose? Are we helping or not helping? It's not good enough that a child has autism and they have troubles with integrating themselves in play or in the classroom. Remember autism and education. There are many contrasts, at least 4 contrasts, for the autistic phenotype in the classroom. It's not good enough that that explains the condition, but we have to lump all of these other things onto it. What are we actually doing? And after the B3 episode, I hope you have more understanding about the core of autism and that innate ability, that innate condition, that we are restricted on fixated interests that are either abnormal or perfect in intensity or focus. Here's the conundrum. The DSM labels B3 as restricted fixated interest that are abnormal in intensity or focus. And the DSM also labels ADHD with an inattention subcategory. Is it abnormal intensity or focus, or is it inattention? As we wrap up today, I hope you can parse out the differences between autism and ADHD. Now, it's true that there are some overlap here, but that overlap are explained by obvious situations. In addition, there are many contrasts here. It does not make sense on why so many people are comorbid. These are very distinct conditions. Before we wrap up, we will have a future episode covering Leo Kanter's autistic disturbances of affective contact and Hans Asperger's autistic psychopathy. We will see that many of these children have autism and only autism, and you will see that some of these symptoms described in the 1930s would classify as ADHD today. In the 30s, with Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger, it was just fine. It was accepted to just have one condition. One condition can explain the phenotype, such as Donald Triplett being self-satisfied, or when he was interfered with, had temper tantrums, which were destructive. Today, that means something totally different than just autism. But in reality, it's just autism. If you're listening to the episode or listening to the podcast, please feel free to leave a review or rating. In podcasting, reviews, ratings, and downloads are huge, and I very much appreciate your feedback. You can contact me on X at RPS47586 or Facebook or email info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. I'm happy to say that in Apple Podcast, there are many high rankings in 6 or 7 different countries for the podcast. I'm very pleased to announce that information. I appreciate you listening. I appreciate your interaction on X. I hope that you are learning about autism. Autism is hard to parse out because we are so saturated with views and opinions and people not knowing exactly what is going on. And before we end, I just want to remind that the cause of autism seems pretty clear to me. It's very clear to me now as we both zoom out and look at the time frame, and then also zoom in and look at the cause. I think this is very obvious, but it has little traction. Research is going in the wrong direction. And the cause of autism is jumping up and down, waving a flag. Look at me. Look here. All of this research is pointing to something in our biological processing, the light, water, magnetism, the items we use, the proteins are involved, all of our biological components. Something has changed. Nothing was added. Something changed. And that change appears to be the change from sunlight and the solar spectra, the 280 to 3100 nanometers, to the isolated artificial light as the electromagnetic field that drives human and living organisms on Earth. Thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast.